Hey, what's up everyone, it's Void. I hope you all are having a great week, and thank you very much for being here. Today we are going to be looking at Zada, Hedron Grinder. Zada is a 3/3 Goblin ally for 3 and a red that says, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell that targets only Zada, Hedron Grinder, copy that spell for each other creature you control that the spell could target. Each copy targets a different one of those creatures. Zada is an extremely fun commander to pilot. We can take his powerful spells that only target one creatures, then give them to all of our creatures. He is in mono red, which like last week's video can be a limitation, but I actually didn't have too many issues being in mono red when brewing this deck. His ability works perfectly in the red color type, and we can spam the board with tons of creatures and then buff them all very quickly. Zada does cost 4, so if you don't draw any ramp, it can certainly be a bit of a slow start, but once he's online, he is online hard, doing tons of commander damage and hurting our enemies' boards. A key note here is since we can use instants on our commander, we can wait until the last second before buffing them with Zada's ability. For example, we can swing with 5/1/1 goblins and then cast an instant on Zada giving him plus 3/0 for example. Suddenly we attack with 5 creatures with 4 damage rather than 1. We can do this after blockers are declared too. So an opponent may decide not to block 1/1s, but by the time they actually hit, they will be very powerful. This is just a small part of what makes Zada such a fun commander, as well as a very powerful one. When brewing this deck, I honed in on 2 key strategies. The first strategy is Flood. In this strategy, we will flood the board with tons of creatures so we can utilize Zada's ability to the absolute max. This won't always be plain creatures, but will also be including instants and sorceries that create multiple creatures in order to flood the board as quick as possible. We will also utilize cheap creatures to make sure we can come online as fast as possible. The next strategy is Target. In this strategy, we will be utilizing Zada's ability to duplicate instant or sorcery spells. Using spells that give plus 1/1 counters, haste, or trample will allow all of our creatures to swing for massive amounts of damage. I've also included some cards that aren't target creature spells here, but pair along very nicely with them and allow us to do even more damage. Before we get started, if you're new here, I want to point out that I will not be covering every card in this deck list. For the sake of everyone's time, I won't be explaining what an Arcane Signet is, for example. If you want to see the full deck list, the link is in the description below. Let's take a look at our first strategy, Flood. First up we have Dragon Fodder, which is a sorcery for 1 and a red that creates 2 1/1 goblins. Then we have Empty the Warrens, which for 3 and a red also creates 2 1/1 goblins, but this has Storm, meaning we duplicate it for every spell we cast for it before this turn. For example, if we play 2 spells then play Empty the Warrens, we get 6 goblins, since this is our 3rd spell of the turn. Then we have Emrakul's Hatcher. Emrakul's Hatcher is a 3/3 Eldrazi drone for 4 and a red that brings in a 3/01 colorless Eldrazi's into the battlefield along with it. For 5 mana, this is a bit of a steep cost, but we can turn and sacrifice the Eldrazi for mana if needed. And if we think about it, we are paying 5 for 4 creatures, not for 1. Then we have Forbidden Friendship, a sorcery for 1 and a red that brings in 2 1/1 creatures. Goblin Instigator is a 1/1 Goblin Rogue for 1 and a red that spawns in a 1/1 red goblin when it enters the battlefield. It being a 1/1 itself means we get 2 creatures for 2 mana. Hordling Outburst is a sorcery for 1 and 2 red that creates 3 1/1 goblins for us. Again, 1 mana for 1 goblin is not bad when we can really buff them up with Zada's ability. Mog War Marshal is a 1/1 goblin warrior for 1 and a red that has Echo, meaning we have to pay 2 to keep it on the battlefield during our next upkeep. However, when it enters the battlefield or dies, we get a 1/1 red goblin. We can either pay the cost to keep him alive, or we can just let him die and get 2 goblins anyways. Ornithopter is an 0/2 Thopter for 0 mana that has flying. Typically we wouldn't want this, except for maybe a blocker, but by buffing it with Zada we can dramatically increase its power and have a huge flyer at our disposal. Rawl's Reinforcements is a sorcery for 1 and a red that creates 2 1/1 blue and red elemental creatures. This is a unique card because despite being in mono red we can have a blue creature on the board. Granted, this likely won't do much of anything for us, but it's still pretty cool. Beetleback Chief is a 2/2 Goblin Warrior for 2 and 2 red that creates 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens. Krenko's Command is a sorcery for 1 and a red that creates 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens as well. Siege Gang Commander is a 2/2 goblin for 3 and 2 red that creates 3 goblin creatures when it enters the battlefield. However, now we have the opportunity to sack a goblin for 2 mana to do 2 damage to any target. This can be a great removal option if we're in a pinch. Young Pyromancer is a 2/1 for 1 and a red that also creates elementals. However, now we get them every time we cast an instant or sorcery, which will likely be 1 or more per turn. Gleeful Demolition is a sorcery for 1 red that destroys an artifact, but if we destroy our own artifact, we get 3 red Phyrexian goblins. This might be worth it if we need creatures on the board, and we might have some extra artifacts depending on which cards we play. Krenko 10th Street Kingpin is a 1/2 goblin for 2 and a red that gets a 1/1 counter put on him when he attacks. Then we create goblins equal to his power. This should guarantee us at least 2 goblins, but if we can hit someone who won't be killing it by blocking, we can do a lot more damage than that, getting more goblins every single time we attack with him. Legion Warboss is a 2/2 Goblin Soldier for 2 and a red that has Mentor, meaning it gives a weaker creature a 1/1 counter. And at the beginning of combat on our turn, we get a 1/1 Goblin that gains haste and attacks if able. Now an important note here, although we can't play sorceries during combats, we can still play instants, meaning we can buff this Goblin that comes in during combat if we want to use our spells. Phyrexian Walker is an 0/3 artifact creature for 0 mana that doesn't have any other abilities. And in fact, aside from the long description text, it's just an 0/3 for 0 mana. Again, this really isn't great by itself, but it can be buffed by Zada's ability, making it a very powerful card. Crimson Kobolds is an 0/1 for 0 that also doesn't have any descriptor text, but it is another way to quickly flood the board. Then we get to one of the strongest forms of flooding the board on our deck, Krenko, Mob Boss. Krenko is a 3/3 Goblin Warrior for 2 and 2 red that taps to create 1/1 goblins equal to the number of goblins we control. This will at minimum be 2 since our commander and Krenko are both goblins, but can quickly be a lot more than that. Krenko is an incredibly strong engine for getting goblins to flood the board with. Now we get on to the next strategy, Target. In this strategy we will use Zada's ability to duplicate spells that target him onto our board full of creatures. First up is Accelerate, an instant for 1 and a red that gives all of our creatures haste and draws us a card for each of them. This can lead to massive amounts of card draw, and getting haste really isn't bad either, especially if we played cards that made multiple creatures into the battlefield during our turn. Just don't forget to leave some blockers. Then we get to Ancestral Anger. Ancestral Anger is a sorcery for 1 red where we once again will draw a card for each creature we have. But now they get Trample and +1/0 since we can only have 1 copy of Ancestral Anger in our deck. If this card is a bit confusing to you, in standard mode of Magic you can have duplicates of cards, so that is why the ability reads the way it does. However, in our game of Commander, we will only ever have 1 copy of it, so X will always be 1. Blazing Crescendo is an instant for 1 and a red that gives our creatures +3/1 until end of turn. It also exiles the card off the top of our library, and until end of our next turn we can play it. We can actually play this on an opponent's turn after they attack us in order to make our creatures bigger and hopefully kill our attackers. And since we can play the exiled cards until the beginning of our next turn, that gives us our whole next turn to play those cards, even if we play it on another player's turn. Blazing Shoal is an instant for X and 2 red that says, you may remove a card with converted mana cost X in your hand from the game rather than playing its mana cost, and then target creature gets +X0 until end of turn. In other words, we can exile a creature, pay 2 red, then we gain +X0 where X is that creature's mana cost. While there aren't that many expensive creatures in this deck, it can still be a good way to buff our creatures in a pinch. Brute Force is an instant for 1 red that gives our creatures +3/3 until end of turn. Again, we can use this after blockers are declared, either on our own turn or on another player's turn. For example, we swing the 4 1/1s, they don't block because they'd rather take 4 damage than lose their creatures, but then we play this spell and suddenly we are swinging for 12 damage and there's nothing they can do about it. Brute Strength is an instant for 1 and a red that gives +3/1 but gives Trample as well. Same thing applies for this too. Crimson Wisp is an instant for 1 red that gives our creatures haste and draws us card equal to our creatures. Dualcaster Mage is a 2/2 human wizard for 1 and 2 red that has flash. When it enters the battlefield, it can copy instant or sorcery spell. We can play this after casting a spell that buffs our commander to target the same spell back at him and basically double up the effects of our spell. If we play our instant that gives our creatures +3/3 then play this, they are now +6/6. Expedite is another instant for 1 red that gives our creatures haste and draws us a ton of cards. Fist of Flame is an instant for 1 red that draws us a card and then gives our creatures +1/0 for each card we drew during our turn. This again will draw us tons of cards and buff our creatures. Now this card is a little tricky, so be careful with it. Notice it draws a card and then adds X equal to the number of cards we drew. Well, since we are playing cards every single time it's copied, X will become bigger the more times we copy the spell. So we target Zada, then get 3 more copies for example. We choose which order to cast the spells, and then we can give our first creature +2/0 from draw per turn and the spell. Then our next creature will be +3/0, +4/0, etc. since we will be drawing a new card every time. Gutter Snipe is a 2/2 goblin for 2 and a red that does 2 damage to each opponent when we cast an instant or sorcery. While this isn't a targeted spell itself, the spells we will be casting are, making this deal out a lot of damage. No, it doesn't fit the theme perfectly, but it's strong enough that I wanted to make sure to include it. Haze of Rage is a sorcery for 1 and a red that gives our creatures +1/0 until end of turn, but has Storm, meaning it copies for each spell we play. So if we played 3 spells before it, creatures would get +4/0 instead of +1/0. It also has buyback too, meaning we can put it back in our hand for 2 mana and recast it again and gain even more power. Otherworldly Outburst is an instant for 1 red that gives +1/0 until end of turn. It also creates a 3/2 Eldrazi when our creatures die during our turn. So we can swing out knowing we will be blocked and killed, play this after our blockers were declared, and then get a lot stronger creatures on the board since most of ours will be 1/1s. Reckless Charge is a sorcery that gives our creatures plus 3/0 and haste until end of turn. We can also play it again later or immediately after to give them another 3/0. Run Amok is an instant for 1 and a red that gives plus 3/3 and trample until end of turn. Again, instant spell means we can play on another player's turn. Samet Spirit is an instant for 1 red that gives us plus 2/1 and haste, but we also scry cards. Note, this is still scry 1, not scry however many creatures we have, so we only get to scry 1 at a time, meaning if we like our top card, it will just be left on the top. Sudden Breakthrough is an instant for 1 and a red that gives us plus 2/0 and first strike until end of turn. We also get treasure tokens equal to our creatures as a great way to ramp. Timur's Battle Rage is an instant for 1 and a red that gives us double strike and trample if we control a creature with 4 power or greater. If we can play a spell that buffs our creatures until end of turn before we play this, it will still do the effect, giving our creatures trample, even though the power will be lost later on. Titan Strength is an instant for 1 red that gives plus 3/1 until end of turn. This also gives us the ability to scry 1, but the early explanation still applies. Twin Flame is a sorcery for 1 and a red that costs 2 and a red more for each target beyond the first, and lets us choose any number of creatures. Then we create a token that's a copy and has haste, but they are exiled at our end step. We will only need to target our commander with it though, since it will automatically copy all of our creatures. Our commander will instantly die since the legend rule, but it will be a copy that dies, so we won't have to pay commander tax. But all of our other creatures will be out, have haste, and will be ready to be buffed with our other spells. Well everyone, that wraps up this week's deck list. Thank you all for watching it through, and if you decide to build this deck, please let me know. I'm also always hoping to improve, so tell me what cards you like and which cards you don't, and I'll try to reply to every comment. Don't forget to enter the giveaway, and as always, stay cool y'all. Peace out.